And welcome to the second Callum Cymru session for Psychology of March 2022. Today's session will be run by myself, Miss Bellis, and I teach psychology at the Allen School. The resources that I go through today, along with a recording of this presentation, will be available on the e-sgol website under the Callum Cymraeg drop-down box. Okay, so last session and the previous recording that I did, we looked at the classic studies in psychology, specifically Rain and Bowlby. And we looked at the methodology and the procedure, and we looked at some essay templates. We're going to do the same again today, but we're going to look at our next two pieces of classic research. We have got Loftus and Palmer from the cognitive approach and Watson and Rayner from the behaviourist approach. Again, we're going to have a look at an in-depth discussion of the methodology and procedures of these studies, and I'm going to give you some ideas on what to include and how to tackle an exam question on this. Then what I'm going to do at the very end of this presentation is I'm going to give you some revision tips that I am then going to come back to in session 4 when we look at exam technique on these classic studies. So just a little reminder on how to start your revision if you're a bit worried and you're not sure where to begin with it. I'm just going to give you a few helpful hints and tips because I know that exams might be quite daunting, especially if you've not done them due to the pandemic. So that is the plan for today, and I hope that this is really helpful and aids your revision and your understanding of this course. So just an overview of where we're at in terms of the psychology course. This is Unit 1, which is past to present, and your AS exam will be 20% of your qualification, 50% of this year, your year 12. Within the past to present unit, you will have to look at classic pieces of research, and you have got 5 studies across 5 approaches that you need to look at in a lot of detail. Today we are looking at the behaviourist and the cognitive ones, like I've already said, and we've already looked at our biological and psychodynamic case studies. Just a little overview of this in terms of the specification. This is obviously what we get as teachers on what you need to know for the course, and I am funneling this presentation down to that last bullet point. So it says, know, understand and make judgments on a classic piece of evidence, including the methodology, the procedure, findings, conclusions, ethical and social implications. We're focusing today on the majority of these sessions on the methodology and the procedure, and that's just because they're quite specific and they are often used as exam questions on these classic studies. Okay, so we're going to start off by looking at our cognitive approach, and we are within Loftus and Palmer and Watson and Rayner's research, specifically Loftus and Palmer. These are possible exam questions, and I went through these again in our previous session. So you could be asked anywhere from a 3-mark to a 12-mark question on the methodology and the procedure of a classic study. We're going to tackle it from a 12-mark point of view today, because we need to know how to definitely grab those 12 marks, because it's the highest amount of marks available on the exam paper. We need to be confident that we can get all of those. So that is our question, and it appears at the top of each of our slides today, just to remind you on what our aim is. Okay, little overview of a methodology and a procedure. What are they? Okay, this is the way that I teach it to my students. A methodology is the ingredients of what you need in order to carry out the study, and the procedure is the recipe. What do we do? If I was to follow a step-by-step guide on how to do Loftus and Palmer's research, I would be following the procedure. What do I need to collect beforehand? What are my participants? What are their ages? Are there any control groups? Was it a lab experiment? That all comes into our ingredients, our methodology. Okay, so that is how I would try and remember the difference between the two. All right, starting with Loftus and Palmer then, there are two experiments, aren't there? There's two sections to this piece of evidence. You've got experiment 1 and experiment 2, and they both had slightly different aims. Experiment 1 wanted to see the effect of leading questions on memory of an event, and experiment 2 wanted to see if information given after an event can cause a reconstruction in a person's memory of that event. So she was looking at two different areas and using the same kind of procedure for each one. Looking at our methodology then, and this is for experiment 1. Remember, experiment 1 is to see the effect of a leading question. A leading question is when you ask a question and you're kind of already alluding to the answer that you want. So, for example, you know, asking somebody at a crime scene, did you see a gun or did you see the gun? Did you see the gun is a leading question because it's implying that there definitely was that weapon there. Okay, that's an example of a leading question. All right, so this is the methodology for experiment 1. Remember, methodology are our ingredients. So it was an experiment. It was a really highly controlled experiment, actually. She had lots of controls in place. And when we're looking at this research, it's really clear what she did and how she did it. Okay, so a highly controlled experiment in a laboratory environment. When you're looking at the evaluation of this, you will come across the fact that a lab actually isn't the best way to look at eyewitness testimony and the effects of leading questions, but that is how she did it. It was a lab environment. And it was an independent measures design. Independent measures design and repeated measures designs are obviously experimental designs that are really important to keep in our methodology. Independent measures design means that you have two separate groups of participants and they just do one element of the experiment. Repeated measures design is when you have one group of people and they do both elements one after the other. Okay, so for Loftus's experiment 1, she had one group of participants doing one thing, okay, one element of her study. She had 5 different conditions in experiment 1, so in brackets EXPT, I've just abbreviated that as experiment, and she had 3 conditions in experiment 2. We need to think about our variables, so our independent and our dependent variables. Remember, independent is what you change and dependent variable is what you measure. In experiment 1, she had 45 American students, and in experiment 2, she had 150 American students. So you will already hopefully be having alarm bells ringing that there is a culture bias because they are only American. There's also a subculture bias in the fact that they are students. And it's quite a limited sample, isn't it? 45 for experiment 1 and 150 for experiment 2. So those are the sort of start of our methodology for this experiment. Did they do then with this? They were shown 7 clips of traffic accidents lasting from 5 to 30 seconds. After each clip, they were given a questionnaire which asked them to give an account of the accident they had just seen. And then they were asked to answer some specific questions on the accident. Now, the areas that I've put in red on the screen are the specifics of the procedure. And when we come to look at the exam sort of essay template that I've written, you will see that I talk a lot about terminology and accuracy of terminology and accuracy of the knowledge that you are presenting to the examiner. And it's things like the bits in red on this slide that will really help you get there. So knowing that they were shown 7 clips, knowing that the clips were between 5 and 30 seconds, and then knowing that they were given a questionnaire. All of those things show the examiner that you know the procedure of this study inside out. On the questionnaire, there was something that she called a critical question, and it was the most important question that she used when she analysed her results. And it asked what about the speed of the vehicle in the crash, which was then recorded. So what speed in miles per hour do you think that car was travelling in the clip that you just watched? Participants are divided into 5 groups, so that's where our 5 conditions come in, and each group was asked a different critical question. And these are the critical questions. The difference, okay, so our independent variable, what we change is the verb in the critical question. So how fast were the cars going when they smashed into each other, collided into each other, bumped into each other, hit each other, and contacted each other? And what Lofts wanted to know was the connotation of that word. You know, if you put the word smashed, does that mean the miles per hour that a person estimates is bigger than it's bumped or contacted? She wanted to know if she could actually distort somebody's memory of something just by the verb that was used. So again, those elements in red, super important when we're looking at specifics in the procedure of this exam answer. And just as I explained, we need to make sure we're aware of our independent variable and our dependent variable. So the verb used in the critical question is what we changed, and the dependent variable, what we measure, is their estimate of the speed of the car. Okay, so they would complete this questionnaire and they would estimate using numbers how fast they thought it was going from looking at a video clip. What do we think? What do we think the results showed in this piece of research? The stronger the verb used, the higher the estimate of speed. So smashed got the highest miles per hour, so the faster the car. And it went all the way down to sort of bumped and hit and contacted, which were much sort of slower in terms of miles per hour. So we were actually able to distort the memory just from changing the verb in the question. Okay, so looking at experiment 2 then that Loftus did, is they wanted to see if there was any stronger evidence that a person's memory of an event can actually be changed or distorted. But they wanted to do that by looking at information that they received after the event. The methodology of this one was quite similar actually to the first one, but they used a different sample, obviously because it was an independent measures design. So it was an experiment, again, really highly controlled, and it was in a laboratory environment. Independent measures design, again, like I've just said, and a new sample of 150 American students. They did this to avoid demand characteristics. If you've already done an experiment looking at clips of a car and asking questions about it, you may change or, you know, act and behave slightly different if you were asked to do it again. So that's why she used that independent measures design, just to make sure that her results were as accurate as possible. They were then shown a 1-minute clip of a film containing a 4-second multiple car accident. They were asked to complete a questionnaire afterwards, which included a question about the speed of the car. Participants were in one of 3 conditions this time, and they were asked either how fast were the cars going when they hit, how fast were the cars going when they smashed, and the final group were not asked about the speed of the car. So she had an extra little control group within this second experiment. Later, the participants returned, and without viewing the clip again, they answered a series of 10 questions about the accident. The critical question this time was, did you see any broken glass? The critical question was placed in a random position amongst the other 9 questions on each participant's question paper. One really important thing to note here is that there actually wasn't any broken glass in the film. They just wanted to know if, if you were asked, you were told they were hit or smashed, do either of those have that sort of perception of broken glass? So again, she wanted to see if she could distort somebody's memory. Independent and dependent variable of this one then, the verb used in the speed question in stage 1 and the DV, what we measure, were the answers to the glass question. Did they see broken glass or not? That's what she really wanted to measure. All right, so that's it for this one. Okay, that is your methodology and your procedure of Loftus's research. Outline that methodology and procedure of the reconstruction of automobile destruction, an example of the interaction between language and memory. So that's an example question that may come up, and you have got 12 marks up for grabs with this one. This is an essay structure on how I would tackle this. The question at the top is the outline the methodology of RAIN, but obviously we are applying that to Loftus and Palmer. So realistically, no matter what question you are asked, this essay structure will apply to any methodology and procedure question for any of the classic studies. I will go through it with you now. There's 2 main elements, obviously the methodology and the procedure. And then at the bottom, I have got some things for you to remember and consider. So start with that methodology, the ingredients of the study. What's the aim? What's the aim of experiment 1? What was the aim of experiment 2? Who were the participants? What were their ages? Were they students? Were they American? How many were there? So remember, there was 45 in experiment 1 and 150 in experiment 2. It's those specifics that are really going to get you the marks here. What's the sampling technique? Okay, was it opportunity sampling because it was in a college? Did she just go in and say, I need some people? Did she advertise for it? Okay, think about it. Were there any controls? Okay, there was a control group, wasn't there, with this one? The fact that it was an independent measures design, get that in your methodology as well. Tell me about the IV and the DV. The difference between the 2 experiments and the IV and the DV in that. The fact that it was a lab experiment, okay, the fact that it was really highly controlled and it was the use of questionnaires. And within that questionnaire, there was a critical question, okay, all little bits of detail that can go into your methodology here. Make sure that you have a wide range of knowledge and that you are explaining the points in detail. Do not just list the methodology, okay? You're more than welcome to list the methodology at the top of your exam paper as a plan, okay? That would be great, actually, because it means that you can see everything quite clearly and you won't miss anything out. And then once you've got your plan, elaborate on that when you're doing your actual answer. Moving on then to the procedure, which I said is like a recipe. Explain to the examiner the step-by-step account of what happened. First of all, it was experiment 1. They saw 7 video clips, okay? How long were the video clips? They then had a questionnaire. The questionnaire had how many questions? Was there a critical question? What was the critical question? Can you give me an example of what they were? The changes in the verbs, okay? Smashed, hit, collided, bumped, etc. Pretend you are recreating the study and you need to write a really detailed plan to somebody on what they did. Okay, that's how detailed it's got to be. So they could follow your plan and do the experiment based off of just what you have written. Make sure you have a wide range of knowledge and that you are explaining the points in detail. And again, don't just list what they do. List what they do as part of your plan. But because this is a 12-mark answer, we need to make sure that we're writing it thoroughly and in sentence, and we're making sure that we are really elaborating on what Loftus did. Things to remember. If you can't remember the details, do not make them up, okay? If in doubt, do without. If you can't remember the amount of participants in the second experiment, if you forget that it's 150, but in your head, you remember those 45 in experiment 1, and you think, well, I definitely know there was more participants in experiment 2, just write that, okay? Experiment 1 had 45 participants. However, in experiment 2, there were a considerable amount more participants. It looks much better to the examiner that you know there's more rather than making up a number and getting it wrong. Okay, so like I say, if in doubt, do without. Be specific in your answers, add as much detail as possible, okay? With my students, we always talk about, you know, squeezing out as much possible information you can. So get all of those verbs in there, okay? Tell me about those critical questions. Tell me about the participants. Tell me about those video clips, okay? As much detail as possible, as many numbers and facts that you can. And because this isn't an evaluation question, it's asking you to outline, or if it was to ask you to describe, you don't need a conclusion. So don't waste your time concluding it. You won't get any marks for it, and obviously we need to make sure that we've got enough time to get the real details down of this research. So don't waste your time on a conclusion with this. Okay, moving on then to our behaviourist study. We're going to look at Watson and Rayner. Really famous piece of research in the 1920s that really helped shape the behaviourist approach. We know that John Watson is the founder of the behaviourist approach. He came up with the idea, you know, give me a dozen healthy infants and he will create a specified world, and he believes that everything about somebody is learned from their environment, okay? And he is your guide for this one. He is your researcher, along with Rosalie Rayner. Again, methodology and procedure. So you've got the ingredients and the recipe, and we are going to focus on a 12 marker again. I want to make sure that you are confident with the maximum amount of marks that you can gain here. So methodology, ingredients, procedure, the recipe. All right, so Watson wanted to see if it was possible to learn a phobia through classical conditioning. Classical conditioning, we should know, is a form of learning where you learn through an association. You associate one thing with another. You associate a phobic object with fear. And to see if the fear is transferred onto other similar objects, okay? That's their aim. So what they did was a controlled observation undertaken in a lab condition. It's a bit weird really, isn't it, for an experimental design? So controlled because, as you'll see, there are lots and lots of controls that they put in place. But in order to test the behaviour, there wasn't a questionnaire, there wasn't a brain scan, it was just observed. Okay, it was actually filmed, and if you go on YouTube, there's loads of clips of Albert, the participant, and the different sessions that he went through in the research. But yeah, it was an observation. But it was undertaken in a lab condition, and that's because it was so controlled and there were so many stages within the procedure, which I'll go through. What they did were emotional tests. They wanted to get sort of a baseline of their participant. So they looked at Albert's reactions to the white rat and other objects were first tested when he was just 11 months old. He showed no fear reaction to any of them. So just a reminder, Albert is your one participant in this, so that could go in your methodology. And that means that this is a case study, isn't it? Okay, idiographic. It's looking at that little unique behaviour of one person. He showed no fear reaction to any of them. He reacted violently when a steel bar was hit by a hammer, causing a loud noise. That was something that he was really scared of. He startled, he held his breath, and he began to cry. So that's how they sort of initiated this, right? What's he scared of? What can we use to induce this phobia onto him? Okay, so in session 1, they wanted to establish a conditioned emotional response. So they paired the rat, which was the object that they found that he liked the most, because they tested it on, they gave him a rat, a rabbit, a dog, they gave him fire, and the one that he liked the most was the rat. And so they thought, right, this is the one that we're going to make him phobic of. So the first thing they did was they hit a steel bar to make a really loud noise, because they wanted to make that association between the rat and a loud noise. So they would give him the rat and make a really loud noise to establish that emotional response. A week later, Albert returned then for some more testing. He was shown the rat with no loud noise, and then he was exposed to the rat and the loud noise 5 times. So this is when they really condition that emotional response, okay? They started off by just doing it once after the emotional tests, and the next thing they did was then really instill this fear into him and make him make that association between the two things. So expose the rat and the loud noise to Albert 5 times. 11 months and 15 days, Albert returned for some testing. The research question this time was whether the learned link between the rat and the noise would be generalised to other objects. So I want you to remember, session 1, first of all, what they did was the emotional tests. They found out what he was scared of and found an object that he liked. Then he was given the rat and the steel bar was struck to get that establishing conditioned response. And then a week later, it was exposed to him 5 times. And then they wanted to know, has he made a generalisation? Is he taking his phobia of a rat and projecting it onto other things that were similar to the white rat? So it says here, the research question this time was whether the learned link between rat and noise would be generalised to other objects. So these are the other objects that they used. The rat, wooden blocks, a rabbit, a dog, a seal fur coat, some cotton wool, and John Watson's hair, because his hair was sort of a whitey grey. So they kind of tried to think of objects that were similar to see if he was also scared of those. One really important thing to note in all of this is the use of the wooden blocks. That was a variable that they used to really test whether they'd actually made him phobic of the white rat or just white fluffy objects. So they tried to think of something that was completely opposite to that. So a wooden block, something hard, is the polar opposite, isn't it, of a white rat. So they would test it. They would give him the wooden blocks in each condition and they would see what he would do and he would play with them. Fine, wouldn't bother him at all. So it really told them that, oh, this is working and we are actually making him scared of objects that are white and furry. We're not just making him scared of absolutely everything that we hand him. In session 4, so remember, it was emotional tests, initial exposure of the object and the noise, exposure of the object and the noise 5 times, generalisation to other objects, and now we've got changing of the environment. They thought, oh, well, maybe he's associating this room with being scared, and that's why he's reacting the way he is. So they took him out. So they looked at the effect of changing the environment and changing the setting. So 5 days later, Albert was taken to a lecture hall. He was placed in the middle of a table in the centre of the room, and then they did it again. They gave him those different objects. They gave him the wooden blocks, they gave him the cotton wool, they gave him the rat, and they wanted to see what happened. Okay, was he just scared of the rat? Had that association been made? And then the last one is the effect of time. So they wanted to see, okay, so is this going to sort of wear off after a week and he won't be scared of the rat anymore? Or is this something that is going to be, you know, a long time? Is it a lifetime phobia that we've given little Albert? Now, if you think about a phobia that you may have, or a friend may have, or a family member may have, lots of the time phobias are created when we're younger, okay, which matches up with this idea that we can be conditioned, and something that happens when we're young can really impact us when we're older. So they really wanted to see, actually, have we done this? Is this forever now? Is he going to be scared of that white rat for a long time? So at 12 months and 21 days, just note that that's Albert's age. He was tested one last time. The final test involved a Santa Claus mask, a fur coat, the rat, the rabbit, the dog, and the blocks. So emotional testing, initial emotional response, conditioned emotional response of 5 times. Then they looked at generalisation, location, and time. Those are your 5, 6, if you include the emotional testing, main elements of the procedure of this study. So when we are looking at the methodology and the procedure of Watson and Rayner, we need to make sure, again, that we have got all of the relevant elements to make sure we've got those 12 marks down for this. So if I go back a few slides and I go here, again, it's this universal essay structure that I have made, and we can apply it to whatever classic study you want. So if we have a look at this from Watson and Rayner's point of view, what is the aim of the study? Well, they wanted to see if they could condition a phobia onto a young child. They wanted to see if phobias can be learnt. Who are the participants? Okay, so we had one male child. He was 11 months old, and which means that this was a case study. What was the sex? He was male. What was the number? It was 1. What was the sampling technique? Okay, so this was done in a university, wasn't it? So sampling technique probably would be opportunity sampling. Were there any controls? Okay, we know that it was a highly controlled experiment. Okay, so it was a observation in an experimental setting, and it was really, really controlled because of all of the different sessions that they went through. But there wasn't a control group, was there? They didn't have another participant that they also tested this on. Again, make sure you have a wide range of knowledge and you are explaining the points in detail. Don't list them. Then moving on to the procedure, and that's where the marks really are within Watson and Rayner. So step-by-step account, go through those 5 or 6 sessions. Emotional testing, how did they do that? Okay, how did they initiate that feared response to start off with? What did they then do? They made sure that he was scared of it. They hit the bar and presented him the rat 5 times. Then they looked at generalisation. How? What were the objects that they used to make sure that he had, you know, generalised the phobia onto other things? So cotton wool, a rabbit, John Watson's hair. What about the wooden blocks? Okay, why were they used? They were this obscure variable that they added in to really, really test that he was definitely scared of white furry objects. After generalisation, they looked at location. They moved into a lecture theatre. They thought maybe they made him scared of a room, okay? Those specific things. And then time, okay? So about a month and a half later, they went back and they did some more testing to see if he still had that phobia. So all of these things are really important elements that you need to bring into your procedure. Again, pretend you are recreating the study and you are telling somebody step-by-step guide on how to do that piece of research. Make sure you have a wide range of knowledge and that you are explaining the points in detail. And again, things to remember. I know I've said this once before. If in doubt, do without. If you can't remember a specific element of the methodology and the procedure, leave it out, okay? If you can't remember the objects that they used to generalize to see if there was a generalization, say there was a varied amount of other white objects, okay? There was also wooden blocks. Rather than making up a big list, okay? Definitely looks better if you're specific and you don't say something incorrect. And be specific, like I've said, in your answers and add as much detail as possible. And again, you don't need to conclude because it's an outline or a describe question. Back to where I was before. All right, I just want to quickly run through some revision techniques with you that I think would be really useful when you're starting to get to grips with your revision of this unit. There's a lot of content in this unit and lots of it has to be remembered. And I know that it's quite daunting when you look at your notes that you have. There is a lot. But these are some of my top tips on how to start your revision. The first thing that I would create is a glossary of key terms. Go through your notes and write down all of the terminology that you need to know. It will help with terminology in your answer. Okay, we know terminology, depth and range are what get you those higher marks. So go through your notes. So we know it's Albert. You could say conditioning, conditioned response, generalization, time. Okay, case study, observation, controlled observation, lab setting. All of those things are really important within this research. Give me a definition of what they mean next to it, okay? Just a glossary of key terms. Once you've got that and you understand that, then I would apply it to an exam question, because you can't write an exam question if you don't understand or if you're not able to remember what to put in it. Okay, so that's the first thing that I would do. There is a resource available on that. I do have some glossaries of key terms that are blank that can be filled in on different approaches, which I can send to the e-sgol team and they can make sure that they are on the website. So I will do that. Another thing would be condensing your notes down. It's really easy for me to say, oh, condense your notes. Well, what does that mean? What is condensing your notes? And it's making sure you've got the most important information on a cue card, on a poster, or however you like to present your revision. The red information on these slides, I would take that as condensed information. So if you go back through this presentation, you'll see that I've put elements of it in red. That's me condensing it down for you. Use what I've put, pop it on some cue cards. Another really, really important and quite useful thing to do is to have trigger words around the house. Having information coming to sight at random times will really help you remember specific details. So write, little Albert was a controlled observation on a piece of paper. Stick it to a wall at home, somewhere where you see a lot, so the kitchen or the lounge or on the sofa or wherever. And as you walk around the house, you'll see just little triggers that will help you remember. Making posters is great, but it's making sure that if you stick them to a wall or you stick them somewhere at home, that the font is big enough for it to be read quite quickly. Okay, that's my top tip with trigger words around the house. Put them on post-it notes, put post-it notes everywhere where you will see them. Listen to this lecture, okay? Using headphones and listening to someone talk through an approach or a study is a really good way of listening to it again, and some of it will be embedded into your long-term memory. Using headphones as a way of embedding revision into everyday life. Instead of thinking to yourself, right, I'm going to sit here now and I'm going to revise for an hour, well, try and bring the revision into your life rather than it take over your life. So headphones in and listening to this lecture whilst you're walking to school or whilst you're walking to work, or if you're on a bus, or having the trigger words so that you walk around your house and you can just see them, okay? Setting your phone lock screen to the notes page of your phone that has some information on, okay? Bringing it into your peripheral life and peripheral environment really, really helps to get started with revision. And it kind of takes the pressure off you by saying that you have to sit down for an hour and make as many cue cards as possible, because it's really, really difficult to concentrate for that amount of time. So those are just some starting revision techniques that I have used before and I've used with my students, and I think that they really, really work. But what I will do, as I said at the start of this presentation, is I will go through some more revision techniques later on in these sessions, and obviously they will be uploaded onto the website. Thank you so much for joining. I hope that this has been helpful, and I hope that I've given you some insight on how to answer those questions. And then, like I said, the next section for me is on comparing the approaches in psychology. So it's a really, really important element of the course, and I think it's one of the most difficult, really. Looking at two whole approaches and comparing them is a real skill. So I'm going to go through some example answers in the next session so that you can have more of an idea on how to tackle that in your exam. And then the session 4 is going to be exam technique on these classic studies. So some revision techniques, how to push for the top mark bands, and I'm also going to show you some example answers there, and we can go through a really good example of a written answer for this. I'm just going to check there are not any questions to answer, but yeah, thank you very much for joining, and I will see you in the next session.